Hello, welcome to American Government. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 9, American Government and Political Parties. So what we're going to be talking about today is the role of political parties in the political process, why we have two parties, and what parties actually do for or not do for American democracy. Political parties have basically three kinds of functions, according to the book. That is, they organize, they find candidates for office, they field candidates in elections, they find money to pay for election and campaigning. Second thing is parties provide a certain kind of brand. That is, they give a shorthand definition of what a candidate stands for, what expectations are of how they'll behave in office, what kind of policies they'll stand for, what they will try to do when they're elected. Leadership is the third function. Leaders of parties set agendas, they set the expectations for people elected as party members, and they set expectations for the organization and the brand. The fourth function that parties provide is leadership. That is the party discipline. We've got four leaders of the party here, down here at the bottom of the page. Chuck Schumer is the majority Democratic leader of the Senate. Mitch McConnell is the minority Republican leader of the Senate. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House, representing the Democratic majority in the House. Kevin McCarthy is the Republican minority leader in the House. Along with these leaders, parties have a position called a whip. A party whip is a person who works behind the scenes, basically to try to maintain party discipline, to get people who are members of the party to vote for certain kinds of issues or to pursue certain policies that the party wants to pursue or that the leadership of the party wants to pursue. Okay. Parties have existed in American history since basically the founding of the Republic. As soon as the Constitution had been written, immediately there emerged various people who came together to propose certain kinds of ways of doing things, certain kinds of interests. The first of these were the Federalists, who supported the Constitution and its ratification, and followed Alexander Hamilton into a kind of informal type of party. Parties got more formalized in the 1820s and the 1860s with the creation of the Democratic Party in the 1820s and then the Republicans in the 1860s. By 2016, when Donald Trump represented the Republicans and Hillary Clinton represented the Democrats, you had 17 parties active in the United States, each that had a candidate for the president in 2016. Not all parties, put this way, some parties nominate candidates that other parties have also nominated. So Donald Trump was the candidate not just for the Republican Party, but for the Republican Party and other parties. So was Hillary Clinton. So parties can do this, and if the candidate doesn't object, then they go on to candidate as a representative of that party as well. There are also 46 state level parties that operate only at the state level, not at the national level. Usually they have some state central kind of thing about education policy, et cetera, et cetera. There are also a number of minor parties, and there have been dozens and dozens of parties that have existed over the years in the United States, but they're no longer in operation. So think about this, why just have two parties? Part of the reason is because the US is not a parliamentary system. That is, it doesn't rely on a majority to win an election. In a place like England, you've got a parliamentary system. A political party has to win a majority in order to form a government. They have to have 50% plus one vote in parliament in order to form a government. And if an election doesn't lead to one candidate getting a majority of the vote, they might be asked, they have to form a coalition before they can actually form a government, so that if they win, say, 40% of the seats in parliament, they've got to come up with a coalition that will get them to 51% of the seats in the parliament. But in the United States, all you have to have is a plurality. That is, the majority wins the election. The person who gets the most votes wins the election, I should say. And so a candidate doesn't have to get 50 or more percent. They can get 40% of the vote, 30% of the vote, even 20% of the vote. If nobody else gets more than they do, they get elected simply by getting the most votes. And so what this does is it creates a system in the United States where you don't have a clear majority in power at any given time. And also you have the federalist system. So you've got national, state, and local levels. So you can have, say, Democratic Party controlling the White House, Senate and Congress, but you have Republicans controlling most of the governorships in the states. And you might have a split in terms of who controls state legislatures. Oftentimes, the local elections and local positions are not identified by party. They're nonpartisan elections for, say, town mayor, city council, board of education. Those kind of positions are oftentimes not identified as being with the party. And so party discipline is not very strong in the United States. It's not uncommon. You can see right now, Joe Biden wants to get his agenda through Congress, and it's being held up in the Senate by a Democrat, a member of his own party, Joe Manchin, who decided that he doesn't like this program and he doesn't want to vote with the Democrats, and so he's actually holding up the agenda. One question is about why doesn't the U.S. have multiple party system? And that's partly because of the lack of a majority system that would allow for that more. But also, there have been many third parties that have run and fielded candidates, and sometimes for multiple elections, such as the Populist Party back in the 1890s, but they've never won enough to actually get people elected to Congress or the Senate or into the White House or even in governorships. And so third parties in the American system tend to come and go. They tend to rise at times when the other two parties seem weak or when there's a crisis. A lot of discontent. Some people are predicting that the Republican Party may break apart in the next few years because of support or opposition to Donald Trump. Others are predicting that the Democratic Party will fall apart pretty soon. Well, in American history, particularly the 20th century, has been dominated by the Republican and Democratic parties. No other parties have really done anything. And all the presidents, the 18 presidents that have been elected since 1920, I should say, 10 of them have been Republican, 8 of them have been Democratic. And they come in waves, it seems like. 1920 to 1933, all 3 presidents were Republicans, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And then things shifted dramatically towards the Democrats with the election in 1932 of Franklin Roosevelt with his New Deal program to deal with the Depression. And for the next 36 years, Democrats completely dominated the White House and Congress as well, controlling the White House for all but 8 of those years when Eisenhower, the Republican, was in office. 1969, it shifted back to Republicans again. And so for the next 40 years, up until 2009, 28 of those years were dominated by Republican presidents. 2009 may signal a shift back towards Democrats once again, when Barack Obama got elected and then re-elected, and then Joe Biden got elected in 2020. So there may be a period now of, again, Democratic power in the White House, and maybe that will spread to Congress, the Senate, and the state legislatures and governorships. We will see. Well, parties, how do they go about getting their candidates and their nominees for office? Now, they use 2 kinds of devices. One is primaries, the other is convention. For much of American history, the party convention was where candidates were chosen. The party leadership would dominate the convention. There could sometimes be fights at the convention, and there'd be break-off groups that would try to get another candidate in, and ultimately that resulted in sort of backroom deals and smoke-filled rooms where they would make agreements and they would barter and trade in order to get their candidate the nomination. Since the 1970s, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have been more open about how they nominated their candidates. They use primaries now. So each spring of each election year, each of these parties will hold primaries, and people can vote for their favorite candidates to run to represent that party in the general election. In some states, you have closed primary systems, like New York. You have to be registered as a Democrat or Republican to vote in that party's primary. Some states have open primaries. You don't have to be registered as a party member to vote in the primary. It depends on the state. Ultimately, what people vote for in the primaries is not the candidate themselves, but the delegates who will go to the convention and vote for that candidate at the party convention. The Republicans have completely open system where whoever wins the most delegates wins the nomination. The Democrats have a more controlled system. They use what are called super delegates, who are party functionaries and officials, elected officials, and people who work for the party, like governors, senators, congress people, big city mayors, other kinds of people like that, who are not elected by the primary voters. They actually are appointed by the party, and what they're there for is to, in effect, control the party's nomination, so that the electorate, no matter how enthusiastic they might be about a candidate, if the party leadership doesn't think that candidate can win, the party leadership will prevent them from being nominated. Such was the case in 2016, when Bernie Sanders mounted a significant popular challenge to the nomination of Hillary Clinton, who was the party elite favorite for the nomination. Sanders won a number of primaries, but the superdelegates ensured that he had no chance of ever being nominated as the Democratic candidate in 2016. Okay, so if you're thinking about a career in politics, think about these kind of things. What does it take to get elected to office? Is it your looks? Is it having lots of money? Is it having charisma and being a dynamic speaker? Or is it actually being a serious thinker and having a political agenda? Well, in terms of the looks thing, think about the 1960 election. John F. Kennedy was more photogenic and telegenic, and that was the first election when the candidates were actually on live television. And Richard Nixon did not come across on live television very well. Kennedy won a very narrow victory over Nixon in that election. Research indicates to us that in the 25 elections since 1920, the taller candidate has won 18 times. Now, how do you know whether they're taller or not? Well, on TV nowadays, they might have short people standing on boxes doing those debates and stuff like that. So they look like they're pretty much the same height. But when you go to actual talks or see the candidate in person, you can tell how tall or short they are. And the taller candidate is the favored one. Most presidents these days are well over 6 feet tall. 6'3", 6'4", even 6'5". Joe Biden, I think, is just over 6 feet, so he's actually relatively short these days. Money does matter. In the 16 elections since 1960, the candidate with the more funding has won 12 times. And so having more money does matter, but it's not necessarily a deciding factor. For 1/4 of this time, the candidate who spent the lesser amount of money has actually won the election. Charisma also counts for something. In the 1932 election, for instance, Herbert Hoover, who was a widely respected expert on government matters, was the president at the time, had a plan for dealing with the Depression, but it wasn't clear what his plan was, and it didn't sound like it was very exciting, and people weren't encouraged to think that Hoover was going to help them out of the Depression. But Franklin Roosevelt was an incredibly dynamic, charismatic speaker who told the people, we're going to give you a new deal, and it will resolve the Depression, and we'll get everybody back to work here, and said you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And so he won a sweeping victory over Herbert Hoover and brought in an era of democratic domination in American politics. Having an agenda can be a good thing, but these days, keep in mind that it's got to be soundbite. It's got to be short. It's got to be pithy. It's got to be something that people will remember. Voters don't seem to want to spend a lot of time actually thinking about what your agenda will be. They're not going to read anything about what you want to do in office. They want you to tell them what you're planning to do. Donald Trump was the master at this, right? His build that wall slogan was a great thing to come up with in 2016. It was so vague, nobody actually knew what it really meant, where the money was going to come from, what it would accomplish, why it was good for the United States to have that wall. But it sounded like a good slogan, and it actually helped him win the presidency. Okay, consider another thing here finally, which is that the parties are dinosaurs of sorts. They don't respond very well to change. They like things being as they are. They like the status quo. They want everything to continue as it is. Leadership of the parties, the two big parties, is determined by seniority and age, not by having any ideas or being dynamic or being popular. And that's why when you look at politicians on TV, they look old. They are old. They've been around a long time and long enough to have seniority in the party, and so deserve a position as the leadership. But that means they're pretty set in their ways and set in their agendas. They're not flexible. They're not going to respond to new demands or outsiders coming in, or people who are popular because young people like them. Parties also have their functions set up so that they do the same thing every election cycle. They do the same kind of fundraising. They go to the same donors. They go to the same practices. They come up with the same policies. But they don't like to be changing all the time, because change is dangerous and change can lose election. So if you want to get your message across through a political party, you're actually going to be more successful working outside the party, it seems, through something like an interest group like the American Association for Retired People, or the National Rifle Association, or League of Women Voters, organizations that are long-standing, they have interests that are particular, and they lobby parties to respect and do something about those interests. Social movements are another way to participate in politics outside the party, actually being engaged in protests, being engaged in demonstrations, engaging with things like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. There are also ways to force parties to recognize that they want things. And so one of the things is that because of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have nominated more candidates who are women and minority. They might not support the agendas of these organizations, but they do recognize that they are significant and will have an influence on parties' prospects in the election. Political action committees are a way to donate money to particular candidates or to particular interests that you have. If you're a billionaire, you can donate hundreds of millions of dollars to a super PAC. A super PAC which is not connected to a particular candidate, but will sponsor advertising, will write up sample legislation for elected officials, will fund think tanks to come up with all kinds of ways to influence elections and get your particular interest across. Billionaires generally support fairly conservative goals, such as keeping regulation out of business, making sure that coal and oil continues to get subsidies from the federal government, various kinds of things like that. And so that's where we're going to stop now. Let me know if you have any questions about anything. Thank you for watching this, and let me know if you need any help with anything.